Ukraine has secured promises of billions of dollars in recovery aid and investment, not just from allied governments, but from private investors as well. More than 400 global companies are pledging support at a conference in London. Ukraine needs major investments in infrastructure, energy, manufacturing, agriculture and information technology to rebuild immediately after the war and also to secure its long-term future. New promises are coming in from the UK, the US and also from the World Bank, even though the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the responsibility for reconstruction and to pay for it will ultimately lie with Moscow.
Even as we come together here in London, committed to supporting Ukraine's build-up, Russia continues to try to burn it down. So, let's be clear. Russia is causing Ukraine's destruction, and Russia will eventually bear the cost of Ukraine's reconstruction.
Matthew Schmidt is Associate Professor of National Security at the University of New Haven. He's an expert on defence, security, Russia, as well as Ukraine. And it's good to see you.
Good to see you, John.
OK, I want you to listen to the US Secretary of State on the long-term goals for rebuilding Ukraine. Here he is.
Even as we invest in Ukraine's immediate and long-term recovery, we also have to build a Ukrainian military that is strong enough to protect Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its independence. Not just to defend Ukraine's land, but to defend all that Ukrainians are building and will build on that land.
You know, all of this is sounding a lot more expensive than the $411 billion the World Bank says is needed for reconstruction of Ukraine. Is the reality here the cold, hard truth? No one has a clue how much is needed.
That is the reality. The World Bank report is several months old that they're reporting. And the fact is that number changes every day, every time a Russian rocket hits, or there's a major battle. I think it's important to keep in mind here that Vladimir Putin is not in Ukraine to stop NATO. He's in Ukraine because Ukrainian economic and political development is a threat to his philosophy of political rule. And so if he can stop that economic development, even after the fighting stops, right, in a sense, he can win, right? Or Ukraine can win the battle, but lose the reconstruction, and that's what's at stake here.
Yeah, there is agreement on who should pay for all of this. Here's Ukraine's Prime Minister.
One of the key questions we are constantly facing is who will pay the hundreds of billions for the recovery. First and foremost, Russia must pay for what it has destroyed.
You're just using that World Bank number, which you said is months old, it's $400 billion. That's about a quarter of Russia's GDP. So is it possible, first of all, to force Russia to pay up? And secondly, is Russia capable of paying up without causing economic chaos and misery on Ukraine's border across, across Russia?
It's important that Ukraine continue to make the case for Russian reparations. It's important that the West support Ukraine's case that the aggressor country should be doing this. But the reality, again, is that Russia will not do it and cannot do it. And so that money has to come from elsewhere. It has to come from donor states, and it has to come from direct investment from companies who think they can make money during the reconstruction while doing good there.
Is it possible to get any access to that sovereign wealth fund, which was effectively frozen at the early days of the war, the Russian sovereign wealth fund? Yeah.
It's possible that they could do that, but remember, to get to that kind of thing, you have to get through world institutions that Russia sits on, like, for instance, the United Nations and its allies sit on. So it would be very difficult to pull enough money out of a sovereign wealth fund to rebuild Ukraine. And again, remember, I think the real number, and the caveat here is that nobody really knows. But if the World Bank is saying $400 billion today, by the time this thing is over with, I would guess the real number is over $1 trillion.
Yeah, well, many are calling for a modern-day Marshall Plan for Ukraine. For those who are not familiar with the Marshall Plan, listen to this.
Hooray! World War II is over, but Europe is in ruins. What can a country like the United States do to help? How about setting aside over $13 billion to help rebuild the smoldering continent? That's what the European Recovery Plan, aka the Marshall Plan, sought to do.
$13 billion was about 5% of the US economy at the time, which would be $1.1 trillion in 2023 dollars. So far, the US has promised $1.3 billion in financial assistance, the UK $3 billion in new loan guarantees, and 400 global companies have pledged their support. Looks like there is a long way to go.
So there's enormous opportunity in rebuilding Ukraine, enormous opportunity. And I suspect there will be a lot of companies rushing in when the shooting stops. But they need insurance now, actual insurance policies to protect their investments, to get them to invest. And the other thing to remember at the Marshall Plan is it worked because it was money that was paid out in a community of nations that were rebuilding themselves together. And in this case, Ukraine is alone. And so Ukraine is not rebuilding itself while its neighbors are rebuilding itself. So the Marshall Plan isn't a perfect metaphor for what's going to happen here. But the key thing for Ukraine is that they have to have foreign direct investment. They have to have companies that think that they can make money when they invest in Ukraine, because the donor nation money almost certainly will not be enough.
Matthew Schmidt, as always, good to have you with us, sir. Thank you.